Yeah, I just want to say my own personal thanks to the Imperial team for organising the symposium and putting on what has been like a really great selection of talks. Definitely very engaging, very inspiring. And this next seminar should hopefully live up to what's come first. So we'll be looking at money matters, responsible banking and pensions. And I want to thank the panelists for attending and also all of the audience for attending. So I'll briefly introduce myself and the panelists, and then hopefully we'll have 35 minutes of discussion, and then there should be 15 minutes or so of question and answer at the end. So feel free to put any questions in the chat as and when you think of them, and then I'll come back to them at the end of the session. And we can direct them to whichever panelists are best placed to answer them. So my name's Shennan, and I've been involved with Positive Investment Oxford for nearly 2 years now. I'm a PhD candidate in organic chemistry as applied to biology and medicine. So conspicuously, I don't have a finance background, but I've taken a real interest in some of the student campaigns around the city that have tried to hold organisations with large endowments, such as the university, to account. And furthermore, a particular focus of our work at PI Oxford recently has been in engaging with the student body in their choice of banking services providers. So we've definitely kind of encountered some of the issues that are of relevance to today's conversation. But on to our panelists. So I'll begin with Jeanne. So Jeanne Martin joined ShareAction in 2017 as AGM coordinator and is now a senior campaign manager in the banking standards team. Previously, she attended the UN Climate's talk as a youth representative and volunteered for the UK Youth Climate Coalition. She has a BSc in Environmental Policy and Economics from the London School of Economics and an MSc in Environmental Technology from Imperial College London. When she's not working, she can be found running in Victoria Park, swimming in Lidos, or baking. Welcome, Jeanne. Thanks for joining us. On to David. So David Hayman is a senior campaigner, policy specialist, and strategy professional with over a decade's experience in the international development sector. More recently, David was at the One campaign, where he worked directly for the co-founder as a special advisor on global strategy and campaigns. Prior to this, David spent 3 years working in India, supporting a range of foundations, philanthropists, and charitable initiatives, including leading the expansion of Skoll award-winning NGO Educate Girls. David's career also includes periods in strategy consulting, working at Accenture Development Partnerships, Bridgespan International, and Citi Private Bank in New York. David is a board member of the CARES family, which works to address issues of loneliness and isolation amongst the elderly in the UK, and was co-founder of Future First, an organisation committed to building alumni networks for state school students. In his retirement, David hopes to be the first octogenarian to run a sub 4-minute mile. Thanks for joining us, David. And finally, Amy. Amy Robinson is the Corporate Projects Manager for Triodos Bank UK. Amy's work focuses on developing strategic partnerships and building the company's change finance agenda, and has a particular focus this year on COP26. She represents the bank in a number of networks, including the APPG-led Bankers for Net Zero project, the Aldersgate Group, and the Finance for a Just Transition Alliance. Her previous and current voluntary positions include Cabot Institute's Advisory Board, Environmental INET SW, Sustainability SW, the Design Programme, the Architecture Centre, and the Bristol Green Capital Partnership. So thanks very much for joining us as well, Amy. So I think we'll begin maybe by just looking at banking and pensions separately as kind of two key areas of today's conversation, and then hopefully bring them together towards the end of the discussion to look at kind of general themes running throughout. So maybe if we begin with Amy in your role in kind of commercial banking. A lot of our attendees today are obviously students. So I was wondering whether you could speak about how students can ensure that their banking services provider is responsible. And in particular, what sort of research can we do as students, and how can we do our due diligence, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a good time to be, I think, asking this question, because I think a few years ago it would have been much harder to find out the answers to these kinds of questions. I mean, I think the important thing is to understand what it is that matters to you in your banking, because it's not a kind of this is good, this is bad question. And it's also really important to consider what your bank is trying to do and how they're trying to change, because I think it's very fair to say, you know, the financial sector is, you probably heard this, is a super tanker. It's taking a long time to transition. So it's not for me to sit here and say all of these guys are doing things wrong. Ask your bank, you know, look at their websites, talk to them on social media, challenge some of their claims. I think those are really important things, and consider the things that matter to you. So if human rights is the most important thing for you, if it's more about environment and biodiversity, if it's more about social investment and supporting local communities, different banks have different areas that they like to focus on and have more expertise. So I think you can look around and understand some of that. There are numerous campaigns, and obviously we've got people here talking about other aspects of finance, but recently there was one launched called Bank.Green in the UK and globally, I think, that looks at banks specifically in terms of whether or not they invest in fossil fuels and make recommendations on that basis. So there are certain things like that out there that you can consider. And I think what's important, the other thing that I just say on this is that there is an important distinction between banks who are making changes to their own operations, which is very important. And you're probably familiar with the kind of distinction of scope 1, 2, and 3 in terms of impact. And if not, that's to do with scopes 1 and 2 is much more about the impact of the actual business or the organization, and that applies across any type of business. Scope 3 is much more about supply chain. And lots of people are doing a lot of work in scope 1 and 2, but in the finance sector, you've really got to be looking at what people are doing in scope 3, which is about where they're investing. So lots of organizations will talk about how they're becoming greener, they're becoming net zero in their own operations. That's vitally important. If you're a finance institution, it's a drop in the ocean. What they're doing to invest their money is what you need to be looking at.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much. And I guess specifically with kind of students in mind, we're definitely not the biggest investors out there. Therefore, can you kind of comment on maybe not levels of impact, but areas of impact which consumer banking can have?
Yeah, I mean, I think don't think of it in terms of you're not in a position to have a big impact, because the reality is that as students, you are the customers that all banks want to be having years down the line. That's why you get these amazing offers from banks with hundreds of pounds to sign up, is because they think once they've got you, you know, they'll have you for life, and you'll be the people that are their important customers in years to come. So your decisions now are still important, even if you don't have a big bank balance. And when I talk about banks investing, whether it's your money or whether it's just the money that they have in their portfolios, that's not really necessarily the important issue. So I think if you can do what feels important for you in terms of choosing a bank that aligns with your values, and if you've got an account with a bank already, your voice will be important. So being able, just asking those questions. I mean, I've been in closed door round tables with a lot of banks recently, and I'm not going to name them because that wouldn't be appropriate, who say, you know, getting challenges on these issues from their customers is a big deal. They're getting questions about their environmental performance, the decisions they're making in these areas more and more. And there are people in all of these banks who care about these issues. They find it much easier to do something if they've got the ammunition from their customers of people saying, we want you to change this. Why aren't you doing this? Can you do this? So just a social media message saying, I read this about you. Is this true? Are you doing this? Could you be doing more? Will probably have more impact than you might think.
Okay, yeah. And I think touching on what you mentioned about how we get these great deals because we'll most likely still be with the bank 20 or so years down the line. How can the sector and those minded towards positive investment within the sector use that to their advantage, and how can some of the more ethical banks maybe try and focus more on students or younger people?
First person to do it. When you say use it to your advantage, do you mean in terms of having the most impact as a customer?
I think more actually from the point of view of the industry, and making sure that the ethical banks are as vocal as early on in the consumer's lifetime, so to speak, so that they're able to build strong relationships with the consumers from early ages and keep that going for a while.
Gosh, that's an interesting one. I think it's the whole industry is changing in a way that makes that question more interesting now. I mean, certainly when I was young, I just got a bank account with the same bank that my mum had an account with. That was just what happened. And I think now there's much more visibility. It also used to be the case that you were more likely to get divorced than you were to change your bank. And I hope on both accounts, that's changed, because that's not a great statistic. But I think if you can, part of it is that thing, you don't have to have one bank account with one institution and think that is your financial presence in the world. You could think about having a savings account with one bank and having a current account with another. The advances in technology in terms of apps that will look at your financial sort of presence in one place means you can transfer money between accounts much more easily, and all of these kinds of things. So I think the conversations that banks are able to have with people around how to bank have become far more nuanced, and that and far more flexible. I would guess probably most people, I don't know at your age, but maybe by the time they're in their mid-20s, would have accounts with a couple of different banks, maybe a credit card with a third institution, and that's sort of normal. And you don't have to feel beholden to your bank. You move and you go where you should. And so those conversations that banks can have around, we want to keep you, we're going to do this to keep you, we're going to do these ethical things because we've heard that that's what you want from us, enables the industry to become a bit more fleet of foot, I hope. Not sure that's quite answered your question.
No, brilliant, thanks. And Jeanne, I understand you come at this from a slightly different point of view, much more from the kind of shareholder engagement point of view. Again, the same kind of themes crop up, that as a student or young adult, the idea of holding large financial institutions to account seems quite distant, if not impossible. Therefore, could you maybe share some of your experiences at ShareAction in particular in holding such institutions accountable?
Yeah, very happy to. And just to add on what Amy was saying, I mean, the choice that students are making today have implications for institutional investors as well, because in the UK, at least, it's quite a competitive retail market, and it's quite a slow-moving business. And we found that each year around 3% of customers switch accounts, and over half remain with the same bank for over a decade. So the choice that you make with respect to your bank is actually really important to these businesses, especially because let's take the case of Barclays, for example, their retail business is extremely profitable. So if they suddenly lost a lot of customers because these customers were dissatisfied with the bank's kind of position on climate change, it would have a material impact on the bank. But in terms of shareholder activism, it's quite an exciting tool to use to drive corporate change. And it's basically, as a shareholder, you have a bunch of rights that you can use to influence a company's strategy. The first one is to attend and ask a question at an annual general meeting, which is an annual event where the board of directors, so the people running the company, meet with the shareholders, so the people owning the company. And usually these meetings are spent discussing the company's financial accounts, and perhaps, you know, a major controversy that it's been involved in the past year. But we think it's a unique opportunity to hold companies accountable. And so every year we send what we call AGM activists to the AGMs of major banks and other companies, and allow them to ask questions on topics that matter, including climate change, workers' rights, childhood obesity, and other things. And in the UK, at least, any shareholder can ask a question. So, you know, as a student or as a citizen, you don't need to have a massive kind of portfolio of shares to attend an AGM. You actually just need one share. And we think it's a powerful tool because it's a great way to put your issue onto the agenda of the board, but also raise awareness of your concerns amongst the bank's investor base, who will also be dialing into the AGM. Now, AGMs at the moment are held online, but when they were held physically, there was also an opportunity to actually directly speak to the board and have a conversation with them about a topic that mattered to you. So that's the first thing that people can do to try and influence a company strategy. The second one is to file a shareholder resolution. And regulations around the filing of shareholder resolutions vary from one country to the other. But in the UK, you basically need a group of at least 100 shareholders who together own £100 worth of shares in nominal value on average. So that means that you can actually file a resolution with a group of 99 shareholders that own one share each, and then an institutional investor that owns much more. And so that's another way that students and retail investors with smaller portfolios can influence a company's corporate strategy. And a resolution, I would say, is kind of a nuclear option, because what it is in practice is that you're submitting a motion that shareholders will have to vote on. And there are rules around the type of ask that you can make, but basically you can ask a company to set emissions reduction targets aligned with the Paris climate goals. You can ask them to phase out from coal by a specific date. You can ask them to improve their climate risk disclosure, etc., etc. And once it's filed, the company itself has to take a position on the matter, because it will have to decide whether or not to recommend its shareholders to vote for the resolution. But most importantly, shareholders will also have to take a view on the matter, regardless of whether you know them or not, because they will be on the ballots and will have to decide whether or not to vote for it. And it's quite a common tool to use in the US, but in the UK and Europe, not so much. So it tends to attract a lot of media coverage, and regardless of whether a resolution actually passes or not, it tends to spur the company into action. So that's another way that students can get involved in shareholder activism. I would say the last one is around voting, but in this case, to have an impact, you would need a bit more of a bigger portfolio of shares. But obviously, shareholders are invited to vote on resolutions every year, and that includes the type of shareholder resolutions that I've just spoken about, but also ordinary resolutions such as the re-election of a specific director of a company. And increasingly, we're seeing institutional investors decide to vote against a specific director for climate reasons, because they think that director is climate conflicted, or they're dissatisfied with the company's progress on climate. And sorry, actually a fourth thing which took place in the last couple of months actually is obviously students can call on their universities to vote a certain way on specific resolutions. And we saw a group of students calling on their universities to, one, vote on a fossil fuel phase-out resolution at Barclays, and two, support a coal phase-out resolution at HSBC and engage with them on the contents of their new coal policy. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that students can do to get involved in shareholder activism, and it's a really exciting tool to use, and I'm very happy to provide more detail on some of the engagements that we've led, if that's of interest.
Of those kind of 3 or 4 strategies, are there any that you've found have met with particular success in the last few years?
So, I mean, I think it really depends on the company that you're engaging with. just thinking broader than just banks and financial institutions here. In some cases, a question is actually enough to spur a company into action. So, in that case, it tends to be companies that are not used to being in the spotlight. And so suddenly freak out when they see that you're attending their AGM and asking them to do something they're not currently doing. And just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, we attended the AGM of Croda International, who I personally had never heard of, but they're a FTSE 100 company, so a very large company based in the UK. And we asked them to become a living wage employer, so to pay all of their staff, both direct employees and contracted workers, to be paid at least the real living wage. So it's different from the minimum wage in the sense that it's actually based on the cost of living. And that question was enough for them to engage with us. And within a year of us asking that question, they became living wage employers. Now, in the case of banks, and as you're probably all aware, they're under increasing pressure to act on climate change and on their financing of the fossil fuel industry. So an AGM question is unlikely to be enough to spur them into action, unless it's a question kind of submitted by a group of large investors, that sort of thing. And therefore, in those cases, more kind of radical options might need to be used, such as the filing of a shareholder resolution.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And so David, maybe you could then briefly kind of summarize this third aspect, the role of pensions, and what role that can play in positive investment for younger investors.
For sure, yeah, and thanks so much for having me. I mean, I'd echo a lot of what has been said already by Amy and Jeanne. I mean, I think there are huge parallels between pension funds and banks. You know, both are large institutional investors with huge amounts of money, by and large investing money on behalf of ordinary savers, like many of the people who are watching this, and be that through our bank accounts, our current accounts, or our pensions. This is our money. There's £2.6 trillion invested through UK pensions alone. This is an enormous amount of money. It belongs to citizens across the UK. And what has happened via a combination of accident and design is a system by which the people who own that money have incredibly little say, influence, and engagement. And this is particularly true on pensions. You know, you think engagement on bank accounts and switching bank accounts is low and difficult. It's significantly more challenging with pensions, a concept which most people don't understand or choose to ignore and forget about and bury away and think about in 50 years' time. You know, most people assume that a pension is sat in a kind of bank vault in Switzerland, slowly accruing interest, waiting for them to access when they turn 65. When the reality is that money owned by each and every one of us is invested all around the world for better and for worse. And as has been talked about already, we believe that we should have more choice and voice in terms of where that money is going and what kind of world it's building. So we think it's an incredibly powerful force for both, you know, potential for good and also potential for bad in the world. And we always kind of ask the question is your money building a world that you actually want to be retiring into in 50 years' time? And I think that's a question that people who are between 18 to 25, I imagine students starting to think about these issues, think about their first pensions. It may feel a long way down the line, but it's the exact kind of question that you should be asking. Where is your money going? Is it building that world that excites you, inspires you, makes you feel confident that you actually want to retire into in 50 years' time? Or is it actually making it more risky, making it less financially stable, making it a scarier place for you and your family? And if you're concerned about these issues, I think bank accounts and pensions are really a critical place to start putting pressure, raising awareness, and making your voice heard. And I think I'd really echo something that Amy was saying. It's something our campaign, Make My Money Matter, really focuses on. That it's actually less about whether you've got £1,000 in your pension or £10,000 or £100,000 in your pension. What matters is that pension funds particularly, and banks as well, have rarely felt consumer pressure, rarely been under the consumer spotlight, rarely had individuals, whatever the size of the pension is, asking them the critical questions: where is my money invested? What kind of impact is it having? And can it be doing better? And the second you start to mobilize some of the public, which is what we're trying to do at a mass level, is get people asking these questions, thinking about their money, asking the questions of the Avivas or the Scottish Widows or the Legal & Generals of the world, and saying, you know, this is my money and I'd like to know more, and I'd like to know how it can be invested better. You really start to see change happen pretty quickly. These organizations which have been kind of absent of public pressure, absent of the spotlight, when people talk about climate change, they talk about fossil fuel companies, and they talk about the meat industry and deforestation. Pension funds are rarely in that conversation, yet they are the ones who are oftentimes funding those organizations, and they have the control and the power to either stop funding them if they feel that they are not the right organizations to fund, or to use the shareholder pressure that was just talked about, which ShareAction is so brilliant at helping leverage, to push those organizations to transition quicker and faster and better. So I just think there's an absolutely huge potential with our pensions, and a huge opportunity for individuals to use their voice and use that power to demand that pensions invest our money more sustainably, and the businesses that money goes to operate in a way which actually kind of creates the world we want to retire into.
Great, thanks. So at the beginning, you spoke a little bit about this kind of lack of transparency that is particularly apparent in pensions, and feel free to jump in, Amy or Jeanne, on this. What kind of needs to change, and how can that change happen with regards to transparency in pension choices and also consumer bank?
Hi, sorry to jump in here, but I just wanted to share the results of the poll, if that's okay.
Oh, sure,
and I think that might kind of shed some light on what the situation is at the moment and how often people are thinking about these issues. So if you can see these now.
Yeah, so I guess particularly pertinent are kind of maybe questions 2 and 4, where we're seeing the extent to which sustainability was a factor in the decisions. And as we might predict, no is the significant winner in question 2. And that's coming from probably what is quite a biased group of people. So yeah, I guess that raises its own questions. Yeah, maybe a key question then is, what are the key roadblocks then? And maybe transparency is one such roadblock. How can we change that number of 72% not considering sustainable activity in their positive investment?
Yeah, maybe I could just run through, because there are quite a few, and I'll run through a couple of them. I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts. I mean, there are problems and challenges around this at kind of every stage of the spectrum, and starting with the public. We are a not particularly financially literate society, and that comes back to our education system in schools and conversations around finance at a young age. It's not something that's well understood at any level, be that bank accounts, be that savings, be that retirement. There's an interesting study came out a couple of years ago which said that you're 10 times more likely to talk publicly about the amount of sexual partners you've had rather than your salary or your investment approach. It's an area that people, you heard the quote from Amy about you're more likely to get divorced than change your bank. It's a kind of weirdly British trait that we don't engage in talking about finance and engaging on our money. And so there's a kind of cultural point, which means that we just don't talk about it particularly. There's a problem within the industries itself, and again, particularly within the pension funds, about communications. What I talked about before, they have rarely felt, it's been quite a passive industry where they've relied on the fact that individuals don't really know about their money, don't really care, don't really ask the questions. And so they haven't had to communicate. They haven't developed an effective communication strategy to share information and share options. There's a point around just pure transparency of what goes into your pension, which means that even now, having spent months and months and months trying to find out, I can't still know exactly what goes into my pension. I don't know who all of the companies my pension provider is investing in. And that is a combination of a quite convoluted financial system we've got, which means that pensions are investing in funds of funds of funds of funds, and it's difficult to track down who the end business is. There's a point which is when you even get to finding out who the businesses are, I think, as you talked about at the start, Ben or Amy, was what does good look like? And being able to give the kind of clear easily digestible metrics which say company X is performing well and company Y is performing badly. You know, there are some objective metrics, some are subjective. You know, some people may feel uncomfortable investing in tobacco or alcohol or gambling. Others may not have a problem with that. Some may feel that certain fossil fuel companies are okay because they're transitioning quickly. Others may feel like they don't want anything to do with fossil fuels. So again, that kind of consistent benchmark, which gives you easy to access answers, is another kind of problem around this. So I think there's kind of a communication problem. I think there's a transparency of information problem. There's a data issue, and there's also just a kind of that the nature of our financial system is incredibly opaque. It is very convoluted. It involves many, many, many stakeholders, and actually tracking my £10 pension investment every month to where it goes is a convoluted, challenging process, unfortunately.
Amy or Jeanne, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, David's points are bang on there. And I think, to give credit to the audience, I would imagine that if one of the questions had been, did you think that your choice of bank or choice of pension provider would have an impact, probably the answer would have been no. And it hadn't come up as an issue. It wasn't that they'd sort of sat there and went, I don't care. It was just not known. I'd worked in the environmental sector for about 15 years when I started working for a bank. And I can honestly say, I just, until really quite close to that point in my career, I hadn't thought about the impact that finance has. You know, I spent a long time working sustainable food, and you think about where you bought things from and whether they were local or organic or fair trade. And that's something that we've kind of got to know about. And this whole finance agenda is very, very new to people. So I think it's, as I said at the beginning, it's a really good time to be having these conversations, because suddenly this awareness is there in a way that it hasn't been before. And I think organizations, well, like both of these guys, but you know, what you're doing to challenge the finance sector gives so much more information that we haven't had in the past. So I think it's as much about the fact we didn't know we could make a difference. It's not that we didn't care.
And if I can add something, I mean, I think the recent developments are extremely encouraging and important, and it's so great to see people starting to realize the power that their pension can have. But my view personally is that actually we shouldn't have to make this choice, and our employer should by default offer us the ESG kind of pension. And if we disagree with the ethos of that fund provided, then we can, you know, decide to move it. But the onus shouldn't be on the employee to decide to move its pension to a more kind of responsible fund. And I would say the second issue for me is linked to what you were saying, David, with the lack of data and the financial system being opaque and it being really hard to understand how these funds are built, etc. But I think ESG is sometimes being is treated as being equivalent to climate friendly. And if you look at an ESG fund, a lot of the top holdings are going to be the likes of Amazon and big tech companies that, you know, are perhaps climate leaders, but are involved in all sorts of controversies, do not pay much taxes. There's a massive pay discrepancy between their directors and the lowest paid staff of these companies, etc., etc. And I think the conversation really needs to move further than climate, really.
Yeah, and I just echo what Amy was saying. Actually, we've just done a piece of polling which says that 80% of the public make no correlation between their money and climate change. You know, 4 out of 5 people just don't make that association. And why would, you know, that's not the narrative we've been told. It's several steps removed. It's a complicated, convoluted space. So really, like the critical thing that we're working on is trying to change that and trying to get people to think when they sit down around the dinner table and think about what are the 3 things they can do for the environment this year. It may be traveling less or eating less meat, but it's also looking at where their money is invested. And we feel that that's one of the most powerful steps people can take. And when when this is told to them, when it's framed to them, when you kind of have the story and the opportunity to sell this concept, people get it and they want to act on it quickly. It's just getting that message out there and raising that awareness, I think, is the challenge.
Brilliant, thanks, David. Changing tack a little bit then, onto kind of more positive matters. Are there any examples of best practices that any of you three have witnessed, whether in banking or in pension sectors?
Well, I'm happy to jump in and talk about what we've been doing, because I figure that's kind of why I'm here.
Definitely.
And I'm not at all disheartened to see that nobody has a Triodos account, but maybe that will change. Oh, well, thank you. You weren't allowed to complete the poll, were you? So thanks, David. So yeah, Triodos is 40 years old. It's not a new bank. It's not a challenger bank. We've been in the UK for 25 years, but we're Dutch in origin. And the reason I think we've been invited to be involved in this is because we kind of approached that banking in quite a different way. In fact, in some respects, quite an old-fashioned, traditional way, which is to say that we take the money that's entrusted to us by our savings customers and we invest it directly into projects, businesses, charities, organisations that can demonstrate they have a positive environmental, social or cultural impact. So we don't kind of get involved in money markets and that kind of strange where does that money go question that most financial institutions have to deal with. And I think the two things that we consider to be most important are impact and transparency. So we only lend to people who are going to have a positive impact. And our relationship managers go out in person to every single organisation and talk to them about what they want to do with that money and how it's going to change a community. It might be a community energy project, it might be social housing, it could be healthcare, all sorts of things. And then critically, we put a list of every single organisation that we lend to on our website. So there's a map and you can go to where you live and you can see if there's anywhere local, you can filter by types of organisation. So that level of transparency that David was talking about, that you realistically can't get from a pension fund, means that people who bank with Triodos really can see what that impact is. And that is not a practical solution for the whole finance sector. I'm not suggesting that the big banks should go out and try and replicate that tomorrow. Thank you very much for that link. But it's kind of an example of going back to slightly first principles around what's important in banking, about understanding that it can have an impact that's positive. And people talk a lot, I'm sure you've heard in this conference, about impact investing. And our approach would be to say that all investing is impact investing. We also have investment funds as well, but I won't go into that now. Everything has an impact. The question is it a good impact or not? And do you know what it is? So that's kind of the most important thing for us. And I think when you're looking at what you might want to do, then considering that there's a big difference between something which is just not that bad and something that's positively good and that's actually making a difference. And as I say, I mean, I worked in the environment sector for a long time and I had no interest in finance, but working for Triodos and being able to see what kind of positive impacts you can have in communities was what attracted me to the bank and what's kept me here. So that's my example of a bit of good practice. I'm sure there are lots more.
Brilliant, thanks, Amy. David or Jeanne, would you add anything to that or your own experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, sorry, Jeanne, do you want to go?
No, I'll go after you.
Yeah, I mean, I think change is happening, particularly within the pension space, and there are examples of good practice which we're being seen. And so some examples we can give, since we launched our campaign, we've been calling for net zero commitments as at a minimum from leading pension providers. And we've had some big, serious net zero commitments from people like Scottish Widows, Legal & General, Aviva, Nest, some of the biggest funds in the UK. To Amy's point, I think there's what's not bad and what's good. And I think getting a kind of baseline, robust, kind of clear, ambitious net zero strategy is good. And then I think you can really step up on that. And so we're seeing some organizations commit to significant investment in climate solutions. So in renewable technology and renewable energy sources, and putting big chunks of money for pension funds into that space. You're seeing some examples of more activist investors where pension funds are turning up, as Jeanne was talking about, going to AGMs, putting pressure on the kind of boards of companies to transition and push them to transition more quickly and more effectively away from kind of carbon intensive practices. You're seeing some investors vote with their feet and divest from practices which they think are damaging for the economy, damaging for the world. And so you're seeing more and more people move out of coal, particularly. I think there'll be more in the future, but people are moving out of coal. So I think there are these practices of positive investments, of divestment where appropriate, of engaging with companies. I think everyone could do more and could do more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, but I would say in the banking sector, in terms of best practice, I don't think there is a single bank that shines out. I think there are pockets of leading practice, but I think there's still a lot of work to do. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the launch of a new net zero banking alliance, which follows the launch of very similar initiatives in the last 10 years, which all committed to take action within 2 years, and then 2 years later launched a new initiative, which then committed to take action within 2 years. And it was launched with great fanfare, and it was launched by Mark Carney, who obviously did a lot of good things when he was governor of the Bank of England. But looking at the guidelines that this alliance published, there were a lot of loopholes, including the fact that banks were required to set targets, but it didn't cover all of their financing activities, including the fact that fossil fuels and deforestation was not mentioned in the guidelines, and lots of other things. So I do think there is still a lot of work to do, even though we are seeing positive developments, especially as David was saying on coal, but not from the UK banks. So we're campaigning very hard for UK banks to publish, and I'm referring to the 5 main UK banks here, but we're campaigning hard for them to publish sector-leading coal policies ahead of COP26, given the UK government position on coal and its involvement in the Powering Past Coal Alliance.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm mindful that we need a bit of time for Q&A at the end, but finally, if you had any general advice for students and how they can make their own financial choices to contribute to a more sustainable future, what would that be? And what would it be outside the remit of banking and pensions?
Well, oh, sorry, David, do you want to? I was going to say, and this builds on what we've talked about already, but in terms of the impact that you can have, you are the workforce of the future. You're the employees that are going to be in demand in the next decade, 2 decades, hopefully more for you, but you know what I mean, in the immediate future. And the challenges that you make to the organizations you go to work for, the questions you ask them about where their pension is, what their agenda is on this issue, on these issues, is really important. I mean, some of you'll be setting up your own businesses and you can make those rules for yourselves. We're a B Corp. That's another kind of sort of strand of conversation around business rather than finance, but making business decisions based on wider social good. So I think you've got a lot of power there, because certainly this conversation I've had with a lot of large employers in the last few years is a lot of the decisions they're making around the direction they're taking is because they want to attract the best people, and the best people don't want to go to work for companies that have poor practices in a lot of these areas. So I think just continue to be challenging on those would be something I'd say. And then I just want to chip it in, because although net zero is vitally important, it's not the only game in town. And actually making sure that when we look at what we're doing now, making sure we have a just transition, and that we look at other issues like biodiversity, which can very much complement the net zero agenda, but we have got the risk of going the wrong way and making decisions that meet net zero targets. But to use a quote that we've been bouncing around a lot at work recently is hitting the targets but missing the point. You know, there's a whole load of other stuff we've got to get right. So that would just be my.
I think that was beautifully articulated, Amy, and I couldn't agree more. And a lot of the changes that we're able to affect at ShareAction is often because of individuals in the financial institutions that we're either targeting or engaging with. And these individuals are not afraid of challenging their own firm and pushing it to go further. Selfishly, I will obviously mention the fact that you can join ShareAction's supporter network as a way to have an impact. We're always recruiting for more AGM activists. We're planning to file lots of exciting shareholder resolutions next year on climate change, human rights, childhood obesity, and other things. And we'd love to work with you on these. Money should not be a barrier because we have a network of individuals that can fund shares for you to buy. So yeah, happy to share more detail about that, but would be great to work with some of you on exciting resolutions next year.
Right, and I'd just say, I mean, I think echoing what we were talking about earlier on, think really deliberately about where your money is invested. So there's an individual action you can take, which is think about the pensions you hold and the bank accounts you have. And my personal story is Barclays came to my school when I was 12, gave me a free football. I signed up with them, and 20 years later, I was still with them, and I never thought about it until I started looking into this, realized that, and this is just my personal opinion, Barclays was one of the largest fossil fuel financiers in the world, certainly in Europe. I didn't feel comfortable with that, and I decided 2 years ago to move to Triodos, and that was an important decision for me. And I'm getting the thumbs up from Amy, which is good. And you know, I think these are decisions that we don't think about. We kind of do it because of social pressure, do it because you might get £50 free, do it because they come into your school and give you a football, do it for whatever reason. But these are some of the most important, powerful, long-term steps we can take. And so whether it's your bank account or whether it's your pension, it's really being deliberate about doing the research. See, one of the questions in the chat is, what's the best pension fund? You know, I can't really give that answer, but there's plenty of research out there which looks at pension funds according to their climate commitments, according to their work on human rights, because it's not just about climate, according to their other investment strategies, and make deliberate, proactive, positive choices. Because over the course of your life, for most people, a pension is going to be the largest investment pot you ever hold. And you should be thinking about where that money is going. The average pension pot in the UK is £30,000. It's a really significant chunk of money. What kind of world is that building? So I'd really focus on individually being deliberate and proactive about choosing where you put that money.
Great, thanks very much to all of the panelists. We'll move on to the Q&A session now, and we've got time for a few questions. So I'll begin with a question from an anonymous attendee. Is there any progress being made on an easy-to-use, jargon-free mobile app that facilitates shareholder activism for retail traders and the public, similar to the Revolut Robin Hood framework? And if not, what would your opinion be of the constraints that hinder this development? So maybe Amy, do you want to kick us off with that one? Or if anyone wants to jump in first.
I'm actually double checking the name on something because I want to get it right. So if anyone else wants to jump in while I have a quick look.
I mean, I think from my side, we've seen, firstly, this is exactly what's needed. And it's an area which is ripe for disruption, which is being able to, as you've got with a certain apps, being able to see where like you've got with the Triodos app, being able to see where your money is invested, like you'll be able to see with the Monzo app, being able to kind of track your spend and get really kind of detailed insights into your spending patterns and things like that. We would love to see that with pensions. And there are a couple of apps being developed, one of which is something called Tomelo, which is being, there you go.
That was the one. I just wanted to double check. Yeah, that was the one I was going to mention.
Yeah, set up for kind of two purposes. The first, to help people understand where their money is invested. So to give some of that visibility and transparency, which I was talking about at the start, which is distinctly absent. So you can go on and see where your money's invested. Secondly, to link it to some of the stuff that ShareAction is doing, which is enabling individuals to have voices and votes on the companies that they're invested in. So if my pension includes Amazon, for example, and there is a vote coming up at Amazon's AGM on their climate commitments, an app like this will enable me to register my preference. And now all of the preferences will then go to the pension provider, who can see that through their members, 80% of them would like them to vote favorably on the Amazon climate resolution. So again, it's an app which helps you see where your money's invested and be more empowered to take positive steps. And Tamello are a great organization, and they're rolling that out with they're trialing with Aviva at the moment, I believe, and a couple of others. And so I think there'll be lots more of that kind of service developing over the next couple of years.
The reason that I was specifically wanting to mention Tamello, and I crossed myself, I couldn't remember the name immediately, is that the guys that set it up are Cambridge University graduates who did it pretty much out of uni because this was something they were looking at. They realized that nothing existed and they went off and did it. And it's a really good story of people just like you guys finding something they cared about and trying to fix the problem and you know, turning it into a successful business. So I really like it from that aspect as well.
And that sounds like kind of the perfect answer. Then this question's maybe best aimed at Amy, but anyone can obviously chip in. What can governments do to improve transparency in retail banking, specifically with respect to sustainability? And that question comes from Cabot.
I think there's a lot happening now around reporting. So some of you may be familiar with TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, which looks very much at climate from a risk perspective. And that's now something that is going to come in the UK, and all finance institutions are going to have to report on that. It's not the answer, but it is a good first step. But we, for example, are working with an organisation called PCAF, dreadful acronym, but it's the Partnership for Climate for Carbon Financial Disclosures. It just doesn't scan very brilliantly in English, but the idea is that is looking at the whole way in which an institution's portfolio has a carbon impact, looking at all the different aspects and how that works. And I think that's hopefully going to become that, or something like it will become a standard that is adopted across finance sectors, so that we have got some kind of uniform way of understanding things. Because I think the problem we've got at the moment is that every organization has picked its own kind of ways of talking about these issues, its own ways of talking about the impact. And when you're trying to compare like with like, when you're trying to understand the industry as a consumer or as an investor at an institution level, it's very, very hard to do. So I think that that's kind of a key area that is now starting to progress. No one solution is perfect, but I think it's one of those, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good situations. We've just got to move things on. I'd say the same thing about the Bankers Alliance. I'd completely agree. It has a lot of work that needs to be done to get that to really be what it needs to be. But we've got to start somewhere and just kind of keep plodding away with these big institutions.
Great, thanks. So I think we've probably got time for one more. I'll let one of the organisers cut me off if not. So for each of the panelists, this question comes from Caroline McKnight. What have recent trends been like in the sustainability shift? What narratives have been most convincing for people to shift their bank accounts or pensions? Maybe Jeanne, do you want to start with that?
I can tackle the first bit of the question, but obviously because we don't really work with customers, etc., I'll leave that to David and Amy. I mean, I started working for ShareAction 4.5 years ago, and I think the investment industry has changed so much in the last 4.5 years. It's just incredible. We're now able to have really detailed conversations with investors about a company's transition plan and what needs to go in there. And obviously there's also lots of investors that are still stuck in their ways and not having these discussions yet, but we're seeing an increasing group of investors that are running out of patience, really, and increasingly happy to escalate their engagement with companies by, for example, attending annual general meetings, by signing up to letters, by making press statements, filing shareholder resolutions, etc., etc. And I think that's really, really encouraging. And zooming in on shareholder resolutions, I mean, the first one that I probably properly worked on was a resolution at Shell, the oil major, and it asked Shell to set emissions reduction targets in line with the Paris climate goals. And we worked so hard on this resolution, lobbied lots and lots of investors. It triggered a lot of conversations in the investment industry. And then the resolution got around 6% of the votes, which was so low. It was incredible. It was so, so depressing. It did still have an impact on the company because a couple of months later, Shell became the first oil major to set targets. Now, these targets are intensity-based, they're way too weak, but it was still a big shift in the narrative. But the support for this type of resolution has done nothing but increase over the last few years. And one example of that is the resolution that we filed at Barclays last year, which focused on fossil fuel phase out and therefore was quite action oriented and received the support of 24% of shareholders, which shows that, yeah, the industry is thinking and is getting more and more ambitious, but lots remains to be done, which is why organizations like ours are very important, I would say.
Thanks, Jeanne. I'm concerned that we might not have time to address the rest of that question, but David or Amy, if you had comments, maybe you could put them in the chat with regard to that, just while I wrap up. But I do want to say a massive thank you to all three of the panelists, Jeanne, David and Amy, for joining us on the Responsible Banking and Pensions seminar. It's been definitely really interesting and particularly pertinent to many of us as kind of young investors, whether we know it or not. Thanks to all of the questions and to the audience. And I just want to reiterate my thanks to the Positive Investment Imperial team for putting this all together and arranging it.